All right, so these 4 weeks are designed for us to do nothing but look at the cross so that when we hit Easter, we have Good Friday. It's one of my favorite services of the year. We get together on the Friday, I think it's 6 o'clock, and we just reflect on the cross. Like, what is it? What does it mean? What actually happened there? And then we gather 2 days later on Easter Sunday. We talk about the resurrection and all that the resurrection means. And the reason why these 4 weeks we're spending on the cross is we just don't want to approach Easter or Good Friday lightly and kind of let it pass by us quickly. We want to understand all the beauty of it and all the power of it. And so I invited you last week. Would you take a look at, read Mark chapter 11 and just start reading there. It's like the last week of Jesus' life as we're kind of approaching the cross. And I'll give you some more verses to read this week. And so I'm just believing this, that you're going to get out of these 4 weeks really what you put into it. So I'm inviting you, journey with us through this. And I'm curious if anybody has listened to the podcast called Serial. Not breakfast cereal, but S-E-R-I-A-L, cereal. Nobody. Oh, yes. Younger generation people, like older people, they don't even wonder what a podcast is. Yeah, it's a thing. 48 Hours. Have you ever watched 48 Hours on TV? They're all about criminal cases and trying to figure out who did what. Serial is an awful lot like that. In 2014, Sarah Koenig and Julie Snyder, they began this podcast. And what it was just investigative journalism that originally was investigating the 1999 murder of Hae Min Lee. Her killer had been caught and convicted. His name was Adnan Syed. But the investigation, and the podcast is nothing more than a story. They're just telling the story and investigating the facts and kind of walking us through it. But the longer the podcast went on, the more you realize that there was way more underneath the story than was first understood. In fact, for weeks, Serial, the podcast, had been the #1 podcast on iTunes, and they're currently in their 4th season. They tackled all kinds of stories. Here's why I start with that. We're going to do what they did. I'm going to invite you to take a deep dive into a murder story. It's the story of the cross. And actually take a look at what's underneath the surface of the story, because we started this with last week, and I made some pretty big claims about the cross. Claim number 1, you can't know God unless you understand the cross. You can't know Jesus without understanding the cross. You can't know the plight of humanity, and here's the big one, you can't even know you. You can't know who you are, what your mission is about, the life that God has given you, unless you understand the cross. So here's the question we're going to take a look at today. You ready? Who killed Jesus and why? Who killed him and why? But the question's kind of actually easy on the surface. You're like, well, there's some Roman soldiers, and they nailed Jesus to a cross, put a spear in his side, so the Roman soldiers killed Jesus. But the truth is, they were just acting because someone told them to, and his name is Pilate. Pilate's a Roman governor. Here's his job: maintain order, maintain control. Don't let the people that you rule rise up in rebellion. And Pilate's #1 tool? Fear. His #1 tool is fear, to hold it over the people so that they would not rise up and overthrow him. Because if those people rose up, there's a Roman emperor above Pilate, that if Pilate can't handle the job, he could easily be replaced. And when you're replaced, oftentimes you're killed. Here's what one king, King Agrippa, says about Pilate. In a letter to the Roman emperor, he writes this: Pilate, he's a man of a very inflexible disposition. Has anybody ever written that about you? It's not a flattering thing. It's a good thing for a guy that really needs to be in control. And he's very merciless as well as very obstinate. His power over people, he flexed it all the time. He wasn't interested in religious people, but he was incredibly interested in people that threatened his region, his kingdom, and the place where he was supposed to exercise control. So when Pilate sentenced Jesus to death, he did it reluctantly. He didn't want to get involved in the religious aspects. And here's how the story goes. Ready? The Jews, they had Jesus arrested and brought Jesus to Pilate. They accused Jesus of raising a rebellion against Caesar, claiming that Jesus was a self-pronounced king. Now listen, the Jews knew that Jesus had no intention of being a political rival to Caesar. Jesus, that's not what he was about. But see, the Jewish leaders, they didn't have any power to kill someone. The Romans had to do that. And because Pilate, he didn't care about religious leaders, he only cared about people who threatened his political power. This is what happens when they bring Jesus before Pilate in Mark 15. By the way, most of the time I'm going to say, hey, turn to one passage, let's read this together. I'm going to be all over the place in the Gospels because I want you to understand the big story about who killed Jesus and why they killed him. So some of them will show up on here. I would highly invite you to do this. Would you go and check out some of these scriptures on your own this week and read them? Let me tell you part of this story. Mark chapter 15, verse 1. So they bound Jesus, they led him away, and he handed him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. Total non-committal answer, right? He's like, I guess if you say so. Verse 3, the chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Why was he amazed? Because he wasn't like any other prisoner he ever had. I mean, Pilate had the power of life and death, and Jesus wouldn't defend himself. Everyone else who faced death before Pilate was like, "I didn't do it, there's a big misunderstanding," and they were super defensive because their life was in the balance. Jesus, he didn't defend himself because he knew that his mission and purpose in life was the cross. Actually, 4 times. Pilate tries to free him. Let me show these to you. Pilate tried to free him by sending him to Herod because Herod was in charge of Galilee, the place where Jesus grew up. And he's like, well, hey, if he's not a resident of my area in Jerusalem, let's send him back to Herod and Herod can deal with him. So he sends him to Herod and Herod sends him back unsentenced, unjudged. He's like, I don't want to have anything to do with it. He just sends him right back to Pilate. The second time that Pilate tries to release Jesus, here's what he says. Luke 23, he says, I'll punish him, trying, hoping to make the Jews happy, and then we'll release him. And the crowds of people that were there, the Jews are, no, you can't let him go. The third effort, Pilate says this, he says, listen, during this season of Passover, it's a tradition this time of year, that for you Jews, I would release one of your prisoners. So tell you what, you have this Jesus who's claiming to be the king of the Jews, and I can't find anything wrong with him. I'll free him. Or if you want, there's this horrible criminal over here that we know has killed people. He's been in rebellion against Rome. I'll free one of them. Do you want me to free the super guilty guy, Barabbas, or the guy that I can't find anything wrong with? The Jewish leaders had stirred up the crowd to say, free Barabbas, free Barabbas. Pilate's like, that's not what I expected. He then asked the crowd on the fourth effort, what shall I do with Jesus? And the crowd shouts back, crucify him, crucify him. And at that moment, Pilate walks out in front of the whole crowd and he ceremonially washes his hands to say, listen, I find nothing wrong with the man. I'd rather let him go, because there's a longer story to it, but he was afraid that there was something about this man, Jesus, that was spiritual and of God, and he just didn't want to have anything to do with it. So he washes his hands in front of the people and he says, listen, I'm innocent of this man's blood. You want him killed? I'll deliver him over, but his blood is on your heads. And the people are like, yes. So why did Pilate kill Jesus? It's interesting because Mark, one of Jesus' followers, he writes this, listen to this. It says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. I don't want to lose my power with the people. I don't want to lose my control, and so I would rather satisfy the people around me and make them happy than do what I think is the right and just thing to do. John makes 2 statements about Pilate. It says this. In John 19, it says, when Pilate heard this, that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, It says that Pilate was even more afraid. He was actually afraid of Jesus, didn't want anything to do with him. Because, man, if somebody is of God and you're about to sentence them to death, like, you just don't want to find yourself on the wrong side of God. Pilate's afraid of him in that moment. But here's what's interesting. John also tells us, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Pilate's afraid of Jesus, but he's more afraid of his boss. He's afraid that if these people rise up and those above him start to hear, "Hey, listen, that guy claimed to be a king, and you let him go, and you didn't kill him, and there's an uprising." Pilate's afraid of losing control. He's afraid of losing respect. He's afraid of losing his life, because what will his boss do if they learn that Pilate's not really a friend of Rome? So here it is. Pilate killed Jesus. Why? Out of fear. He's afraid of what people will think. He's afraid of the power that people have over him. But it's interesting. Jesus makes one final state to Pilate, and John records it. It's the last thing Jesus said to Pilate. And he said this in John 19. He said, "The one who handed you over to me is guilty of a greater sin." You get this statement that there's something even behind Pilate. See, listen, watch it. The soldiers killed Jesus, right? But they were just acting because of Pilate. And Pilate killed Jesus out of fear. But then you get this statement that there's something even before that. Who killed Jesus? The Jews killed Jesus. Because Pilate would have never had him if it hadn't been for the Jewish religious leaders. The question is, why did these Jewish leaders kill Jesus? In the book of Acts, chapter 3, there's this speech that is being made. And in this speech, Peter makes it really clear who killed Jesus. And by the way, when he's speaking this is after the cross and after the resurrection in Jerusalem, the same place where the people existed who put Jesus on the cross. He's speaking to them, and he says, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus." Speaking to the crowd of Jews, and you can't read this without, just imagine him wagging his finger at them, all right? "You handed him over to be killed. You disowned him before Pilate. Though he had decided to let him go, you disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this." What could somebody do to these Jewish religious leaders to make them want to kill him? It started out small, but progressively Jesus incited some things. Right off the bat, the Jews, they were all about fasting and showing religious traditions. And Jesus, when they were fasting, he and his disciples were feasting, so they didn't like that. There were things you could do on the Sabbath day, and most of it was involved resting, because that was what the religious system entailed. And instead of resting, Jesus would work in order to help people. When the religious leaders would only hang out with good people, Jesus hung out with the most disreputable people in town. Jesus disrupted their religious systems, because those religious systems didn't actually bring anybody to God. Eventually, though, Jesus started really inciting them. On the last week of his life, when he goes into Jerusalem, he makes this speech, and some of it's to his disciples and some of it's to the religious leaders. One of them is called the 7 Woes. Have you heard of this? He says, "Woe to you Pharisees and religious leaders." It's probably the most confrontational words that Jesus has for these religious leaders. And he's inciting them to drive them and confront them to such a degree that they hate him and want to kill him. In the final week of Jesus' life, one of those speeches is recorded. I'm just going to read to you, I think it's the 7th woe. It's in Matthew 23:27. It reads like this. He says this to these leaders: "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. You snakes! You brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Words you never want Jesus to speak to you. But think about it. I mean, these are all the pastors, so to speak, the most religious people in the Jewish religious system, that he looks at them and he's like, you are all just sons of hell. These confrontational words came from the man who just marched into Jerusalem days before. Get this. He marches into Jerusalem, and the Jewish people who are seeing his power and the miracles in his teaching, they greet him. It's known as Palm Sunday. They greet him, throw palm branches down and throw their jackets down, and they shout, Hosanna, Hosanna, save us. Save us from what? Well, they're thinking, save us from Rome, save us from the oppression, start a rebellion, start an uprising. Listen, what happened when Jesus walked into the city, the momentum had shifted away from the Jewish religious leaders to Jesus. He's got the popularity. It even states in the text that the leaders were afraid of the people because Jesus was getting too popular. And that popular figure, Jesus, stands in the face of the leaders and goes, you're all a bunch of hypocrites. It's a pretty confrontational moment that Jesus has with people. These religious leaders have two problems. Let me give you the first one. It's easy. The second one, it's a little more complex. If Jesus does take the place of power moving forward, whatever that power looks like, and he's looking at these religious leaders and saying, you are all a bunch of hypocrites, what happens to you, religious leaders, if Jesus fully takes power? You're out. You're gone. And so these religious leaders are thinking, we have to do something about this. Second thought, though. What if Jesus actually succeeds? And he takes power, and they're thinking he is going to go confront Rome. First, it's the religious system he's going to confront, and then he's going to go confront the Roman government and lead in this rebellion. What happens typically when someone rises up under Rome and opposes them? What happens to them? They get crushed. And if you're the Jewish religious leaders of the day, and Jesus rises up and he fails, who is Rome going to crush? They're not just coming for Jesus, they're coming for you as well. So in the Jewish mindset, these leaders are thinking, in order to preserve the peace of Jerusalem, living under control of Rome, one man's death is better than the rest of us all being killed. They're trying to keep peace with Rome. And so they justify, let's put this man to death. It says this, in this trial that Jesus has in the middle of the night, which, by the way, you don't try people in the middle of the night. When witnesses can't show up, only the witnesses that you select. It says in Mark 14, then the high priest stood up before them and he asked, Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Says it again. You'll see this on the screen. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. Jesus could have said, I am the Messiah, I am this, I am that. He could have said it in more of a full sentence, but he doesn't. He just says, I am. Now listen, who's he speaking to? The people who had more knowledge of the Old Testament and the history and the story of God's people than anybody else. So when Jesus says, I am, the story that comes to mind, they get this. That high priest is going to know that Jesus is actually making a reference to a story in Exodus. When Moses was sent to Pharaoh to set the people free, Moses is like, I'm scared. If they ask me, who sent me, who do I tell them? And God tells him, you tell him, I am sent you. So when Jesus says, I am, that high priest, he understands what Jesus is saying. He's making this reference to, I am actually of God and from God. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He says, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, this is actually two different quotes that he brings together from the Old Testament, from Daniel chapter 7 and Psalm 110. When he brings this together, if he starts Daniel chapter 7 and quotes the beginning of it, he knows that the high priest is going to know the rest of how that verse goes. Let me read to you how the rest of that verse goes. It says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. That's what Jesus says. Here's the next part. He approached the Ancient of Days, God, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So when Jesus starts that story, the high priest knows you're claiming that your kingdom is going to come and you're going to destroy and work everyone, and you are going to be the all-powerful one of God. The high priest takes his clothes and just rips them because he can't tolerate it anymore. He loses his mind. And he says, do we have to wait for anything else? We know that this man is guilty of blasphemy. By the way, there's irony in those words. Blasphemy is your offense against God. And if Jesus is God, you just convicted him of God offending himself. Pilate, when he gets the Jews, because the Jews' dilemma was this: they can't kill anybody. They can't put anyone to death. So they bring him to Pilate, and instead of accusing him of something religious, they accuse him of something political, of claiming to be a self-pronounced king that stands against Caesar. But listen to this. Pilate saw right through their motives. Listen to what was written about this. It says, for he, Pilate, knew it was out of self-interest. Other translations of the Bible say it was out of envy, it was out of jealousy, it was out of spite. They had handed Jesus over to him. So, don't mistake this. Here we go. The soldiers killed Jesus. They were just following orders. Pilate killed Jesus out of fear. The Jews killed Jesus out of pride. Because pride's that one word that kind of wraps it all up together. Self-interest. I'm the center of my world. No one's going to tell me what's right or wrong. No one's going to tell me what to do. No one's in charge. I'm the authority in my life. Don't disrupt my power. Don't think that you can tell me what to do. It's my life. I mean, we can come down hard on the Jews to say, oh my goodness, yes, look how prideful they are. But come on. How many of us have said the same thing? All right, God, I know you probably want some things for my life, but listen, it's my life, it's my money, it's my time, it's my relationship, it's my career, it's my. Listen, pride is so easy to see in other people, and it's ridiculously hard to see in the mirror. There's been an awful lot done to the Jews throughout the history of the world of people taking out the fact that they were a part of killing Jesus. That is not my intention at all, and you'll see why in just a minute. So the soldiers killed Jesus, and Pilate killed Jesus, and the Jews killed Jesus. But guess what? The Jews would have never had Jesus if it weren't for Judas. Judas killed Jesus. Why? Most people have never heard this before, but there's a theory out there of why Judas killed Jesus. Why he gave him up for 30 pieces of silver. The thought was this: Judas joined Jesus' crew because he saw this motivational speaker, teacher with miraculous powers. The crowd started following, and Judas is like, I'm on board that. Why? Because Judas didn't like the Roman government either. He wants to see this uprising. So Judas is like, I'm all in, let's rise up, here we go. And all of a sudden, Jesus starts saying, I'm going to die. 3 times in the book of Mark, he says, I'm going to die. And all of a sudden, could you imagine if you were thinking victory over Rome and all of a sudden your great leader starts saying, I'm going to die? You become a little disillusioned with your leader, don't you? Now think about this. By the way, this is just a theory, okay? I can't go to the scriptures and prove this, and so take it for what it's worth. Some people have theorized, though, that when Judas started hearing about Jesus saying he's going to die, what happens to the rest of the followers when Jesus dies? Who are they going after next? Hey, the right hand. I'm thinking Judas is in the back row like, yeah, maybe I'm a part of this group. Maybe I'm not. I know he picked me, but man, this is getting dangerous. So they're wondering if Judas didn't go to the Jewish officials and strike a deal so that when Jesus does die, that he has ingratiated himself to them so that maybe they won't go after him, that he might be, because when there's winners and losers, right, whose side do you want to be on? And if Jesus is going to be crucified, he's going to die on a cross, do you want to be on the losing side if you think that's the losing side? So they think that's probably why Judas sold Jesus out. Here's what's interesting. This part is not a theory. This next part is actually a genuine reason why Judas killed Jesus. One of the disciples, John, tells this story. I'm going to cover this story in a couple weeks. The disciples are having dinner with Jesus in a house. And there's a woman there named Mary. And she comes in and she breaks this jar of really expensive perfume and pours it on Jesus, takes her hair down, which you don't do in that setting, and starts wiping Jesus' feet with her hair. And it literally says that the disciples snorted at her in disapproval. And then John records why they were so angry. It says, but one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. Think about that for a moment. Just do your own math. What do you make in a year? That was worth a year's wages. Listen to what it says about Judas. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag. He used to help himself to what was put into it. He's a thief. He's skimming and scamming off the top. That's who Judas was. And so, in this moment, if he knows Jesus is going to the cross, if he knows he's going to die, and he's thinking, how do I get out of the losing group because the leader's about to die? What do? He bargains and he strikes a deal with the Jewish leaders to sell Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And his bargain goes like this: when Jesus has less people around, the crowds aren't there, I'll tell you, and you can go to a place where you can arrest him without much commotion. You know what 30 pieces of silver would have bought for you back then in the first century? A slave. Judas betrays Jesus and has him killed for the price of a slave. The soldiers, they killed Jesus, but they were just following Pilate, and Pilate killed Jesus because of fear, and the Jews killed Jesus because of pride. But make no mistake, Judas killed Jesus out of greed. Super easy to look at this one and throw Judas under the bus and be like, what a criminal, what a crook, what a, stop for a minute. Greed is also one of those things that when we look in the mirror, it's unbelievably difficult to see. Because how many of us have said, listen, God, you want my Sunday? I'll give you my Sunday. God, you want my attendance? I'll give you my attendance. But how many of us actually believe that, God, you own everything I have, that house I live in, the car I drive, everything in the bank account? God, it all belongs to you. I don't think it's any mistake that Jesus, when he was walking the earth, said, you can't serve God and you can't serve money at the same time. It's not that money's bad. Later on in the New Testament, it would say this, that money, the love of money, is the root of all evil. Money isn't the root of evil. The love of money, the greed love, Judas Iscariot kind of love of money is the root of all evil. So that's who killed Jesus. And by the way, do you know this? We actually don't know what happened. We don't have a lot of detail to the crucifixion of Jesus. You know that? All four of the New Testament writers, what they say is, and they led him away to crucify him. We know what happened before that. We know that there was a judgment, and they put a purple robe on him and beat him and pressed a crown of thorns into his head and gave him a fake scepter like he was the king and in charge, and they would blindfold him and punch him and say, oh yeah, if you're so smart, why don't you prophesy and tell us who hit you? And then they strapped him to a post, and we know this from the scriptures that they flogged him with a whip, and that whip would grab his back and pull flesh off of his back. And then when the judgment finally came down, he was given a crossbeam, the horizontal bar, to carry up to this place called Golgotha. And after such a beating, he collapses. This guy by the name of Simon is given the cross to carry the rest of the way. But from that moment on, we don't know what happened on the cross. We know that Jesus said some things. We know he was offered something to drink and he refused. We know he had a spear up in his side. But what we know about the crucifixion is actually mostly from outside sources. Martin Hagel writes a book called The Crucifixion that describes what would typically happen. Let me just tell you a couple of features that he mentions. First, the person would be publicly humiliated by being stripped naked. Often whipped, known as flogging. We know that happened. Actual crucifixion involved a person being laid on their back with that crossbeam underneath them. And then one of two methods of being fashioned to that cross. Either they would be nailed through the wrists or through the hands with nails, and or they would be tied to that cross. And they would be tied there as well as nailed sometimes, because they didn't want, when they raised that whole cross up and dropped into a hole, they didn't want that person tearing off the cross. We don't know if Jesus was nailed there or tied there from the Gospels, but we find out later in the book of Acts that Jesus was actually nailed to the cross. A crucifixion was designed to be as long as possible. Once that person was hung there, nails through his hands and nails through his feet, they would fashion a little post or small little seat behind them. And it would take some of the weight off of their feet and their hands. And you would think, oh, that's nice. They gave them someplace to sit. It was actually designed as a tool of cruelty so that they could take some weight off of this and breathe longer. It prolonged this experience for them. So they would be out all day under the sun, naked in the elements, dying on a cross. And then at night, they would leave them up there, if they're still alive, to be exposed to the elements in the cold at night. And this could go on for days, until that person would either bleed out or be too exhausted to hold their own body weight up, that after all that, it just finally, that seat wasn't enough, and they just collapsed, and it stretches their lungs so much that they would suffocate. I just don't want to be vanilla and sterile about something that's so ugly. I want us to take a deep dive and really understand that Jesus was brutally murdered. Pilate killed him out of fear. The Jews killed Jesus out of pride, and Judas killed Jesus out of greed. But the story doesn't end there. And what I mean by that is this: let's not pretend for a minute that Jesus was a martyr. Because a martyr is someone whose life has been taken from them. His life wasn't taken from him. In John chapter 10, this is one of the things that Jesus said. He said, the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. And then he says, I lay down my life. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. Jesus knew that the mission of his life was going to lead to the cross, and he says, no one takes my life from me. What does that mean? It means that the fourth person who killed Jesus was God. God killed Jesus. Why? It says this in that same speech that Peter was giving to the Jews after the death and resurrection of Christ. Acts chapter 2, it says, this man Jesus was handed over to you, listen, by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. It wasn't a surprise to him. It's nothing that God said, well, if you're going to do this, I might as well kind of like go along with it. No. This is God's planning and God's doing. God put Jesus on the cross. And that you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. Here's what's so interesting in this, is that God killed Jesus, but he doesn't let anyone else off the hook. Not the soldiers, not the Jews, not Judas. They all make their decisions that they're responsible for. But it's all a part of his plan. John 3:16 might be the verse that people know more than anything else. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Don't make any mistake. He gave his son to the cross. Octavius Winslow writes it this way: who delivered up Jesus to die? Not Judas for money, not Pilate for fear, not the Jews for envy, but the Father for love. God killed Jesus out of love for us. Love for you. When you look at the cross, I hope you see how ugly and horrific it is. Because the only thing that outmatches the ugliness of the cross is the beauty of the cross. And I hope that when you see it, you see God's love for you, for the world, for people. And don't be self-centered about it. It's not just for you. It's God's love for everybody. If you think the story's over there, there's one little part to this that we're missing. Yeah, the soldiers killed him. Yeah, Pilate killed him. Yeah, the Jews killed him. Yes, God killed him. But there's one final group that killed Jesus. And I want you to listen to this quote by John Stott. He writes this book called The Cross of Christ. And I've done an awful lot of research in that book. And this is his quote. A lot of what I'm telling you is based off of my research from there and obviously in the Gospels. Here's what he writes. Before we can begin to see the cross as something done for us, we have to see it as something done by us. Who killed Jesus? I did. And you did. We killed Jesus out of pride, out of fear, out of greed. Because we don't get to share in the forgiveness that the cross offers us if we don't see that it was our sins that nailed him there. In 1 John chapter 2, it reads this way. Jesus is the atoning sacrifice. Those two big words, let me keep it really simple. Atoning, paid for, bought, sacrifice, meaning he died, paid for our sins in our place. Not only for our sins, so don't miss this. John is not writing to you and to me. He wrote this thousands of years ago to his community back there. Jesus is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, those in the first century, and not only ours, but then he says this, but also for the sins of the whole world. That's you and that's me. When you walk by the cross, when you approach Good Friday, when you see a cross on a church building, on someone's earrings and someone's necklace, I hope that there's a sense in you that I did that, and it brings guilt. Because until we understand our guilt at the cross, we don't actually get to receive the blessing and the forgiveness and the relationship that God has for us. Now, if you crossed the line of faith decades ago, and granted, every time you see a cross, you're just grateful for what it is that Jesus did for you, that's fantastic. But I still think that there's a sense that our gratitude rises to the degree that we realize that we put him there. Are you with me? Our expression of joy and gratefulness for who God is and his sacrifice of his son on the cross, the joy of that only comes from the depth of understanding that we put him there. So what do we do with that? I'm going to give you three things and we'll wrap this up. The first is this. The cross, I think, is an opportunity for my humility and vulnerability to agree with the truth of who killed Jesus and why. It's like being one of the Jews in the first century when Jesus is like, hey, listen, you're corrupt on the inside. It's like Peter preaching the day after, or the days following the resurrection, when he looks at these Jews, he's like, hey, listen, you put him on the cross. Could you imagine the vulnerability and the humility it took for those Jews to say, you're right, it was me? By the way, that's exactly what happened when Peter preached. 3,000 of them realized their mistake and said, we're totally wrong. What do we do? And Peter says, repent and be baptized. Repent is turn away from this life that you have that is without God and turn to God and run full force towards a relationship with him. But let me read this carefully so that we get this. The cross is an opportunity for my humility and vulnerability to agree with the truth of who killed Jesus and why. You're agreeing that it was your sins that put him there. But can I make this really, really clear? This might be the most important thing you're going to hear all morning. Agreeing with this doesn't make you a believer. Agreeing with this truth does not mean you just crossed the line of faith. In John 3:16, it says, believe and receive. When you make that first step of believing, that doesn't make you a Christian. Look at the second part. The cross is an opportunity for my salvation. That's crossing this line of faith. Here it is, by accepting a relationship with God. See, you can sit here and just go agree. Yeah. I agree. Jesus died on a cross and all these people put him on the cross. And even he died for my sins on the cross. And if you leave it there, all it is your agreement with the truth. You haven't actually received a relationship with God to say, I'm transferring the loyalty of my life from me, I'm only loyal to me, to I'm loyal to you. You have this exchange take place. God, I give you my sin, and would you give me your innocence and forgiveness? That is the transaction of salvation, and it is an intention of the direction of the rest of your life. It is not a prayer about going to heaven. It's a statement about, God, I want this exchange to take place. I not only believe that you did that for me, but I want to receive relationship with you that starts today and continues for eternity. Because whatever you want on earth right now, that's what you're going to get in eternity. If you don't want God in a relationship with you today, that's solely by your choice. He loves you so much, he gave up his son for you. He wants relationship with you, but it only happens if we accept his forgiveness. And if you don't want it today, you don't get it in eternity. But here's the beautiful thing. If you say, God, I totally believe that Jesus died on the cross for me, and by the way, this is not a fairy tale. This is documented by historical documents that we have record of. This is not a fairy tale. We have more historical evidence that Jesus died and rose again than any other event from 2,000 years ago. If you want relationship with him, you start it today and you run full force into life with him. Hey, I know for some of you, you did that years ago, or maybe months ago, and you crossed that line of faith. And so you might think, well, what is the cross then for me? Can I tell you what it is? It's right here. The cross is an opportunity for my gratitude and my trust and my joy and my boldness. And you can fill that in with an awful lot of other things. My self-control to rise as true signs as a Jesus follower. When you approach the cross, or when we have communion around here on Sunday, or when you come to Easter, have you realized at some moments, like, yeah, I started this relationship with God years ago, but where's my joy? I'm going to tell you this, you forgot the ugliness and the beauty of the cross. And maybe you're sitting here today, you're like, yeah, you're right. I don't trust God with my life. There's not a joy there. There's not a boldness. Whatever that is, can I just say this? As Christians, when we come together and we eat and drink this bread and this cup, it's a reminder of the covenant that God has for us. Listen, here it is, that he has adopted us. And he doesn't unadopt his kids. So run full force into relationship with him. I got to wrap this up. Hey, I know for some of you, you've been taught that all you got to do is believe the right things. It's not true. You have to walk in relationship with God and receive his forgiveness. So today, I know for some of you, listen, you might be brand new to church. First day you came in, you're like, dang, this guy's intense. I just got some really, really, really good news that I want to share with you. And maybe you're not ready to cross that line of faith, but I think some of you, you've been here for long enough that you get it. You understand the truth that historically this happened, and the meaning behind it is this. The deep dive into the cross is that God offers you forgiveness so that you can have a relationship with him. I'm just going to say this. Some of you need to cross that line of faith today. I don't mean cross it and then jump back over and live however you want. I mean, you cross the line of faith. You start a relationship with God where now your loyalty is to him. You're giving him authority to lead your life because you trust him, because he's good and loving. He knows what's best. I think some of you want to cross that today and probably need to. I'm going to pray in just a moment. I'm going to pray a prayer that I would invite you to pray. If you want to do that, you're going to start a relationship with God today. I just think some of you are going to cross that line of faith in just a moment. And if you do, I'm going to tell you this. Don't be anonymous. There are no anonymous turning points in the kingdom of God. You're going to tell somebody today. I'm not going to embarrass you and walk you up here. That used to be something people used to do years ago. This is not just between you and God, it's between you and people. But we don't want the embarrassment of trying to come up front to stand in the way of you saying, yes, I'm in. So let's pray. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes. And for those of you that you've been walking with Christ for a long time, if you want to pray this prayer as well, because you know that your boldness is dissipated, your commitment and loyalty is dissipated, you've been wandering from God, you can pray this as well too, as a recommitment to your relationship with God. Before I pray this though, eyes closed, heads bowed, you need to know who's praying this. You need to know if you're actually going to do this or not. So would you do this? If you're going to cross that line of faith, I want you to stick your hand in the air right now. Everybody's eyes closed, heads bowed. I'm looking around right now because there's got to be some kind of accountability. I've got you two in the back and you right here in the middle. I see you, and I see you way in the back and right in the middle. All right, there's hands up all over the room, so let's pray together. God, I believe Jesus died on the cross for me. You use these words, you use whatever words you need to, but would you just whisper these to God? God, I need you. I need your forgiveness. I accept that Jesus died for me, and today, God, I start this relationship with you. I might not even know how, God, to start this relationship, but I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to read your word. I'm going to give you authority in my life to lead my life. God, from this day forward, I'm in your family because right now in this moment at my confession, you are adopting me. Can I tell you, if you just prayed that, this is the beginning of a relationship with God. And so, Lord, I pray for those right now, that those that just prayed that prayer, that you would help this to be a forever decision, that they would realize how much you love them, that as they look at the brutalness of the cross, that it would be only outweighed and overshadowed by how much you love them, that they did that for you. And so, God, thank you for your love for us. And if you agree with this, would you simply say, amen?